So I think when it comes to China and the future of Russia, we need to think more about capabilities and stability and maybe less about numbers.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The New START treaty that was signed by the United States and Russia in 2010 limited both countries to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, placed restrictions on how those weapons could be deployed. The New START treaty that was signed by the United States and Russia in 2010 limited both sides to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, placed restrictions on how those weapons could be deployed, and included strong verification mechanisms to ensure compliance. On February 6, 2026, that treaty formally expired. And now, for the first time in decades, there are no bilateral nuclear arms agreements between the world's two foremost nuclear powers. Joining me today to discuss the implications of the expiry of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty is Corey Hinderstein, Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We kick off discussing how New START iterated upon previous arms treaties between the United States and Russia, what it means that no treaties now exist, and why the question of China's rapid nuclear buildup adds a vexing new challenge to the arms control landscape. There are very few media outlets these days that consistently cover nuclear security issues, and at least in the way that I do, despite, frankly, the existential risks inherent in nuclear weapons. I'm so glad to bring this episode to you. If you care about the future of humanity and want to help me continue to bring you thoughtful episodes like this, please become a paid subscriber. I'm having a bit of a subscription drive this month. We are really close to our goal. Believe me when I say that every new paid subscriber makes a huge difference. In the show notes of this episode, you can find a discount link for a paid subscription, or if you want to pay the full price, go to globaldispatches.org and get a full subscription. Thank you all, and now here is my conversation with Corey Hinderstein of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Corey, to kick off, can I have you take us back to 2010 and just describe the geopolitical circumstances in which this New START treaty was drafted and signed?
When New START was drafted, it was really seen as the next logical step in a multi-decade arms control relationship between the United States and Russia. In 2010, we were facing the expiration of START 2. START 2 had been the successor to START 1. START 1 had been the successor to previous arrangements, including SALT. And so there had really been kind of a generational, and in some cases, when it comes to political leadership, a multi-generational history of arms control. At that time, when I say it was the next logical step, that doesn't mean that it was obvious exactly what it would cover and how far it would go. But I would say it was not an open argument among most people looking at the strategic landscape that there should be another arms control agreement that would come into effect after the expiration of START 2. Now, New START also did follow some other attempts at kind of rethinking arms control, including one approach to maybe have non verified limits. But the negotiators in the end decided to, under the Obama administration on the US side, decided to break a little bit from the George W. Bush approach of having a non verified inheritor of arms control and really continued with the legacy of strong verification that was based around specific central limits, meaning how many strategic nuclear weapons each side could have.
So, what did New START entail and how did it build upon its predecessor?
The main evolution of New START was that it lowered what we call the central limits. Central limits are how many strategic nuclear weapons each side could have. That means the long range intercontinental nuclear weapons. And New START set that central limit as 1,550 deployed weapons that each side could have. That's a combination of strategic bombers, missiles, and submarine launched missiles. Now, when I say deployed and how many they could have, it's also important to recognize that all treaties are based around counting rules. What counts? And there were very specific counting rules as to what these 1,550 would include. And that also meant that everything that could be a nuclear weapon was considered to be a nuclear weapon unless it was declared otherwise and was subject to verification. So that led to a really important continuation of this bilateral transparency and verification, where each side had a certain amount of visits that their inspectors could do in the other country, where they would say, I want to see this missile and I want to be able to confirm that this thing that you've said is not a weapon is not a weapon. And therefore, everything that was not declared that way was considered to be a weapon and it counted under 1,550.
So basically, Russians could come to the United States, ask to visit certain facilities. Americans could go to Russia and ask to visit certain facilities, and they'd be compelled to say yes.
Yes, and we did that for years and years and years. We had Russians here in the United States and Americans in Russia going to nuclear weapon sites and measuring things that were declared not to be a weapon, confirming they weren't. And we did that for up until really COVID was the first disruption of that, where we, because of travel restrictions, had to kind of scale back on the ground. But, this is a perfect example. This was boots on the ground, people in the facilities on a regular basis for a long time. The other thing that New START did in addition is it limited the amount of strategic platforms. So, in addition to how many weapons, it's also how many bombers, missiles, submarines that each side could have, which was 700. And then it also had a number of other provisions like sharing telemetry on nuclear weapon capable systems when they were being tested, for example, or deployed. We also had provisions in particular about non interference with national technical means. And what that meant was that neither side could prevent the other one from using basically spy satellites to track nuclear weapons that were moving around the country. That's
Hmm.
particularly important for the United States because Russia has mobile missiles. That's something that the US doesn't have. And our national technical means were one way of us tracking their mobile missile forces and where they were going in case they were going to a posture that would elevate our perception of nuclear risk. So it's not just the numbers that expired with New START, it was also some of this other transparency and information.
So, did New START work? Was there cheating? Did it largely kind of do what it was intended to do, on the other hand?
I think New START was really effective. We never raised a significant issue about Russia meeting the central limits. We never had a major non interference concern, whether it was NTM or with those on the ground inspections.
What's NTM?
National technical means. That's the shorthand for observation from satellites.
Mm.
It's a euphemism. I'm not exactly even sure where it came from, but it's been around the arms control world for a while. So I think that the treaty worked. The treaty was being implemented by both sides, even during times after the 2014 takeover of Crimea, for example. Tensions were very high between the US and Russia, but New START continued to be implemented. The biggest change happened after the full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, after which the Russia declared at a certain point that they were no longer going to allow all of the New START inspection and verification measures. They then started to be non compliant with the treaty after that, although there had been no issues raised about them actually sticking to the numerical limits, but also, some of those other adjacent commitments that were in the treaty where they walked back.
And so was that part of the reason that the Trump administration decided not to meaningfully pursue a renewal or an extension of New START?
Well, not to get too legalistic, but there is one thing that was going to happen last week on February 5th, and that is the treaty was going to expire. This is a legal treaty that was negotiated and then ratified by our respective legislatures, and it had an end date. The previous time it was extended because the treaty included a 5-year extension provision. This time there was no such second provision. So the treaty was going to expire. So nothing that the Trump administration did or made a decision about would have changed that. That said, we've known when it was going to expire for a long time, and neither Russia nor the United States had been willing to meaningfully engage in a follow on. When New START was negotiated, it was negotiated in time so that there wasn't a gap between START 2 and New START. But we didn't start those negotiations, and therefore there was going to be a gap in that legal framework. The Russians did offer many months ago to extend on a voluntary basis the central limits, right? The 1,550 warheads and the 700 deployed platforms. As far as I know, the Trump administration never responded to that offer and clearly made a decision not to do it. I think the Russian non-compliance of the last few years was a part of that. It's hard to look at a treaty partner who withdrew from all of its commitments early as a reliable treaty partner. So I'm sure there was some concern about that. But in the end, it still would have preserved the status quo of numbers. But the biggest concern that the Trump administration has raised, and President Trump raised this in his first administration also, was that no arms control going forward is going to be meaningful to him unless it also includes China. So that really brings in another really significant complication to looking at the post New START world.
I'm interested in your take on this idea that it seems that throughout the Cold War and even after the Cold War, even to 2010, and really even until now, like nuclear issues were sometimes siloed from other big diplomatic spats between the United States and Russia. And as the geopolitics of our era has hardened, and the United States and Russia have become more antagonistic in recent years, I suppose maybe it stands to reason that arms control would fall by the wayside, but it hadn't always been that way.
No, it really hasn't. And it's such an important point because, I mean, it's a cliche, but you don't negotiate arms control with your allies. You only are motivated to negotiate arms control with an adversary. So the idea that you somehow have to have a good relationship in order to negotiate arms control is kind of a recent invention. The idea that you have to trust your adversary in order to negotiate arms control, the only reason we have these measures is because we don't trust them, because we would rather have an agreement that gives us some insight, verification, and accountability because we don't trust them and because they are an adversary. And in addition, arms control is not a gift to an adversary. It's not something we give on. In fact, we define our negotiating posture for things that will advantage the United States in our perception, or at the very least, keep things even and equal. And so if you talk to folks in the military who've been involved in strategic planning, including our nuclear war plans and targeting, they like arms control because the whole point is to give us a world that is more predictable, where we have more insight, where we have more reliability that our information is correct and that we can plan against. And so that's the uncertainty we now have. We don't know what Russia will do next. We don't know how many weapons they will have. We don't have as much insight into where those weapons will be, what kind of weapons they are. And that creates real complications for planning. So this idea, I think, is really important, that there are, of course, geopolitical and geostrategic conflict is going to play into that bilateral relationship. But we have historically said this is an issue too important to throw out with a broader, diplomatic relationship. We can throw diplomats out of the country, as Russia has done to us. We can have conflict in international organizations. We can even have conflict over the years through kind of proxies. But when it comes to strategic nuclear weapons, it's kind of too big to fail. So we should be able to continue those conversations and that diplomatic engagement regardless.
So, recent reports, and we're recording this on Thursday, February 12th, suggest at least that Russia is planning on abiding by the limits. Of course, I suppose there's no way to verify this, but at least Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said that, the status quo will remain, at least in terms of the limits of strategic warheads that are allowed to be available. What have you heard since the expiry from the Trump administration?
Very little. There was a really important speech by Undersecretary of State Tom Donano, February 6th. And in that speech, Undersecretary Donano raised issues about China in particular and gave that as the primary reason why the United States was not going to extend on a voluntary basis the New START limits. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States is immediately going to build up, and he did not indicate that we are. And they've made no statement about numbers or increased upload. In the short term, the kinds of things that we could do to increase our numbers that we would be looking for, announcements about might be adding additional warheads to existing missiles, for example. We would have the ability to do that, and they haven't said anything about that. But they also haven't said that they are abiding by the central limit, and I think that will be something to watch.
So I'm glad you brought up China again because, as you mentioned earlier, that's kind of the issue that's hanging over these negotiations and this topic because of the Trump administration's insistence that any new arms limitation treaty includes China. Now, China has been rapidly increasing its nuclear capacity, but it is still far, far behind the United States and Russia, frankly. Despite its kind of rapid progress, it still lags far behind. China, as far as I can tell, is not interested in these sorts of limitations because they're so far behind, despite their rapid progress in recent years. So, do you see any sort of opportunity to loop China into some sort of arms limitation treaty or at least enter some sort of productive negotiation?
I think it's unlikely that China would engage in anything that looks like a real arms control negotiation. And it's exactly for the reasons that you said. Despite the rhetoric about China's kind of looming nuclear threat, and to be fair, they have implemented a rapid buildup, but it's all relative. They were starting from a position where they had so many fewer nuclear weapons than the United States or Russia, just a couple of hundred. They want to ramp up, and they have built an infrastructure to allow them to do that. So it's not that I don't take it seriously. I take it very seriously, but they're still way behind. And frankly, I would rather constrain them where they are. If we want them to enter negotiation on an equal ground, that would mean that we are kind of creating the three-party problem that we're worried about. And so I see no motivation for China to engage in real arms control until they get to a position of strength for that negotiation, which will take them many, many more years. That being said, there are ways to engage China that isn't a negotiation about limited numbers of weapons, including, we tried to do strategic stability talks with China in the last administration and had one meeting that the State Department convened, a small meeting. I wouldn't say it was productive, but it was a start. But then they kind of refused to engage further. What I think is really important is during this time of uncertainty, let's not pile on additional risk. So, can we talk about transparency? Can we talk about ways in which we will continue to have open lines of communication, crisis management, et cetera, so that it may not be a treaty, but I think there are ways to introduce some of that greater stability and predictability into the relationship that arms control is trying to get at. The real problem is if we stick to numbers as being the definition of strategic arms control, we run out of options really fast. We run out of options with China because, they're not on equal ground with us. we run out of options with Russia also because they may keep their numbers, but they are developing and deploying, novel and destabilizing types of weapons, things that can be in continuous operation. Some of these novel weapons are quite frightening, and I don't think it's a one to one. One of our silo based weapons does not equal one of their nuclear powered cruise missiles, for example. So I think when it comes to China and the future of Russia, we need to think more about capabilities and stability and maybe less about numbers.
So that, I mean, at least to me, suggests an entire rethinking of how previous generations have approached this question of arms control. At least maybe when it comes to China, what could the US give up in terms of restricting its own capabilities that would entice China to potentially give up some of its own capabilities?
I think when it comes to China, we're not even at the question that you've asked
Hmm.
because the United States is not going to come down to China's level on numbers, and China is not going to stop while they are at such a disadvantage. So that matches this idea that numbers may not be the right metric. When we think about capabilities, the Chinese also have no history of engaging on these issues. When I think about Russia, we have decades and entire bureaucracies that are built around these dynamics and how to do a negotiation and how to engage. Although, and I will put as a side note, we're losing that expertise in the United States in the same way that they're losing it in Russia. My colleague Nicole Grajewski at Carnegie has made this point that we don't have the Russian language speakers, the Chinese language speakers, the Russian and Chinese strategic analysts in the same way that we had this wealth of knowledge during the Cold War about Russia. And that really helped us in those negotiations, not only for what we could ask for, but what their perspectives were and how we could play into those in our negotiation. With China, they don't have it and we don't have it because we don't have this history. And so we're really starting from scratch. And I think we need to start with concepts related to strategic stability and related to avoiding strategic surprise. The biggest problem in the nuclear field is surprise. You never want to be presented with a changed dynamic in the strategic environment where that you either don't have an answer to or have to make a decision really quickly about how to respond. And that is the biggest destabilizing force.
And I think that just underscores your point that, unlike the United States and Russia, where there are decades and decades, you said earlier, generations of arms control agreements and expertise, we, at least until very recently, seem to like understand each other. And when Russia says something or when the United States says something, the other side kind of knows what they're saying, where that is just not the case with China, where we don't have that kind of familiarity and we don't have that kind of history and culture of understanding each other's intentions. And I think that's kind of where it gets, frankly, frightening.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we need to invest in that, regardless of what direction we think things are going to go. Investing in people who can have that knowledge and build that expertise and have that insight, cultural insight, language insight, and strategic insight, that will help us no matter what direction things go.
So the New START Treaty expired formally about a week ago. In the coming weeks or months, what are you looking towards from the United States or Russia that will suggest to you whether or not maybe this New START will limp along as a voluntary agreement or whether or not previous agreement will just be kind of blown up and we might enter an entirely new phase?
I mean, obviously, the biggest concern that people have raised, and I share, is that we kind of spill into an arms race. And that, I think, is not going to be good for the United States, certainly. It's not going to be good for Russia, and it's certainly not good for the world. These dynamics are extremely uncertain right now. And as we talked about earlier in our conversation, we are letting, both in Russia and in the United States, we're letting the breakdown of our broader geostrategic relationship affect these nuclear questions in ways that are, frankly, as you say, scary. And so I think what I'll be looking for is statements about the investment or reinvestment in additional nuclear weapons on either side, deployed weapons, including areas where, that weren't covered in the treaty. One of the faults or the criticisms of the New START treaty was that it didn't include tactical nuclear weapons or the shorter range weapons. Those are particularly important when it comes to China and, theater or regional nuclear weapons. So there are ways that I think the United States could react that wouldn't necessarily be in our best interest. What I want the United States to do, what I hope Russia will do, is make decisions based on real calculations of their own strategic interest and not just respond, react, and try to go tit for tat in a way that is not helpful. I think it's actually a position of strength for the United States to say our deterrence is strong, our extended deterrence is strong. Those countries under our nuclear umbrella are being reassured. The people of the United States can be reassured that our deterrent posture remains legitimate and reliable even in this New START world. And that if Russia makes certain announcements or China makes certain announcements, it doesn't by its nature, question that undermining principle. I think it's a position of strength to say that. And I think it's also the reality. But what I would worry about is this kind of political rhetoric becoming a military fait accompli. And that, I think, could take us into some dangerous directions.
Well, Corey, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. This is really helpful.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.